welcome. Thank you so much for joining this session as part of Learning Planet Institute's quite remarkable Global Festival of Education. We are delighted to be a part of it. There is a kind of a cast of thousands here. Before you're going to meet a research team, which has been involved for the last year or so, exploring the question of how learning ecosystems can contribute to ensuring that all children in adversity thrive. We will talk about what we mean by adversity shortly, but we had enough in focus, particularly the millions of children in the global south facing very diverse circumstances of adversity. And we wanted to follow up on previous work, which you also say a little bit about, on how learning ecosystems can make an extraordinary difference to their fate and their future. So my name is Valerie Hannon. I would have been delighted to be a member of this research team. To open us up, I'm going to have a kind of a conversation with my dear colleague, Michael Stevenson, who I'm sure many of you know. Michael adopted the role of sort of strategic director of our research. And between us, we're just going to spend 10 or 15 minutes kind of laying the groundwork for two panels, which will explore different aspects of this question. The first panel will be kind of mostly thinking about strategic policy-related questions. The second panel will be coming at this, this whole set of questions really from a slightly more practitioner perspective. But as you will see, they segue into each other and are deeply related. And we have a very extraordinary group of people to whom we're very grateful indeed, who have consented to be part of our panels, some of whom were part of the research, some of whom have been outside observers, but all of whom are extremely knowledgeable about this area of education policy. So in this conversation between us, Michael and I thought we'd cover off things like, what does this question mean? Who was involved? Who funded it? Why did you do it? What did you do? What did you find? And what are your recommendations? So just to kick us off, I ought first of all to express our gratitude to both the Templeton Foundation and also particularly the Porticus, who funded the research and have hung in with this work for a number of years now. And we're deeply, deeply grateful for the faith they've shown in us in thinking that this is an area which we believe certainly is worth exploring. And if you put up the slides, Catherine, I don't know if there's one up already, you will see there the partner organizations, in addition to our funders, who were the partners actually working as ecosystems in the field. And in addition to this a set of six organizations, we also conducted a set of interviews with colleagues across the world who were perfectly placed to comment on a critical issue, which is the relationship between learning ecosystems, which for the most part are funded and supported by philanthropic effort, and how that relates to what we'll call the mainstream policy environment and framework. So, Michael, I wonder if it's worthwhile saying very briefly what we mean by ecosystems. I think probably most people joining this call will be pretty well aware, but it might be worthwhile just setting out for them using the next slide, please, Catherine, and then the one after that, which tells us, first of all, what we mean by an ecosystem and kind of what their special traits are, Michael.
Thanks, Valerie. I think ecosystems, which obviously are kind of a term that come out of biology and describe a phenomenon in the natural world, it's been an incredibly important metaphor in education. And what it describes, very simply, is a set of organizations coming together, working in relation, in collaboration, emotionally intelligent in their work together to achieve something powerful. And in education, we've seen this combining formal learning, very often what happens in schools, non-formal learning, that's to say learning with real education outcomes, but it certainly doesn't happen in a school. might happen in a sports team, or I don't know where else, and informal learning, which typically is, what happens in the family unit. So a combination of formal, non-formal, and informal, a range of diverse providers from different sectors, and always connecting learners with a diverse range of resources, people, and experiences to support continuous holistic learning. And I've always felt that, in a way, they were also innovative, certainly in the education field. This is where you'd go, a remarkable ecosystem to see new approaches to what kids learn, how they learn it, how it's assessed, if it's assessed at all. So innovation is another concept right at the heart, Valerie, I think, of these learning
Yeah,
ecosystems.
it is, Michael. And we also thought there were two real sort of defining traits of the learning ecosystems, especially with relevance to the Global South. If you show the next slide, please, Catherine, slide 3. Maybe I'll start, Michael, by talking about an ecosystemic way of working, which is much more relational, much more profoundly engaged with local leadership, much more concerned with the sort of predominant narratives that define what learning really is and who's engaged in that. But there's also, perhaps you want to say a bit about this, a commitment to much wider objectives than the classical determination to look at academic outcomes. And that is to do with the whole notion of human flourishing.
Exactly. I think the purposes of education are, at long last, beginning to shift. For a long, long time, all around the world, it's been a lot to do with educating people for jobs. And that's an important thing to do. But I think increasingly we're recognizing that that's not enough, and that we need to educate people for human and planetary flourishing. And that's going to be about broader objectives from the point of view of the child. No one's saying you don't need any longer to bother about your maths, your science, and your reading. But those are simply foundational capacities that should support much more profound competencies for the new world, the flourishing world. And that might be about how young people learn to act in the world, find their purpose, to understand the world, to reconcile competing worldviews, to appreciate the world, the role of beauty, and therefore needing to be not just problem solvers, but also ethically competent. And that concept of human flourishing, I think it's going to move forward in OECD school systems. We know it's already beginning to move forward. When I say beginning, it's long been moving forward in these ecosystems in the global south, with commitments to well-being, safety, community, agency, and purpose. So I think we would feel, wouldn't we, Valerie, that the ecosystems we've had the privilege to work with these last year or two are, as you say, not only demonstrating ecosystemic ways of working, but this profound commitment to enabling every child, even those in great adversity, to achieve some form of flourishing.
Indeed, they were. And we showed the 10 at the top of this presentation, 10 ecosystems working across Africa, Latin America, and in Asia. And we held a series of workshops with them to explore this issue about how we really accelerate the shift. How do we take systemic learning from the margins to the mainstream, to the centrality of thinking and funding in government policymaking? That, in a sense, was the heart of our inquiry. So we held a series of workshops. We held a series of conversations and interviews with some of the people on this call and well beyond that. And we came up with a series of proposals, which I think are on your screen now, a kind of strategic framework. Maybe we'll very quickly touch on what these suggest or propose. They will be at the heart of the two panels which follow this conversation. And as I've said, there were 4. Maybe I'll kick off with the first one, Michael, which was around this notion of orchestration. And what we felt was that too often, ecosystems are competing in the philanthropic space for the next grant, for the next piece of funding that will see them through the next 2-3 years. But actually moving to the mainstream is at the heart of it. And we want to see organizations set up, you call them accelerators or strategic units, which provide a kind of center for both advice and advocacy, globally, but particularly in local context, especially with governments, to argue for the value and the power of ecosystems to be at the heart of education policy and practice in any given locality. And we think that's missing at the moment. There are a couple in the global north, and indeed there's some of them on this call, which we're going to be talking to them, but not really as extended a set in the global south. Then, Michael, we were thinking about the whole issue of how policy is made relevant, which is something you thought about a great deal.
Yes. If you talk to 100 policymakers in a morning seminar online around the world, I don't know how many of them would start talking about ecosystems, but it wouldn't be very many. Most of them think in terms of, what they're formally charged with, which is strengthening formal school systems. That's the day job. So the argument is that if we're really to see non-formal learning and learning ecosystems come right into the middle of the policy-making process in order to enable full flourishing for every child across Latin America, Asia, and Africa, we will just need to demonstrate how important this is to the policymakers. They've got to see that they're not going to make it only with the schools they know and love. It's not instead of the schools they know and love, but it's vital to draw on these much newer, richer traditions of non-formal learning in order to really achieve these emerging policy objectives. And as education for human flourishing, originally moving through the UNESCO arguments, increasingly recently through the OECD, becomes the centerpiece of purpose and policy making. It's going to take the two. It's going to take the formal system plus the non-formal system, and we all need to make the argument why to convince the policymakers.
We do, and in order to do that, we need really strong ecosystems at work now to do this work demonstrably, really, really effectively. So to achieve that, what became apparent in our workshops and indeed our interviews, that we need much more powerful collective capacity building. We're aware, of course, there are a number of communities of practice already extant around the world, but one of our proposals is we need to establish, and we think we have the kind of foundations for it, a South-South collaborative for shared infrastructure and collective capacity building. We think that's going to be vital if we are to demonstrate that policy relevance, Michael. But we want to change the narrative too by being capable of showing some proof of concept cases.
Yes, we are zigzagging across the screen here, so we're now bottom right. Number 4, last big thought. You've got to show it working, not just the fabulous learning ecosystem, but in country, be it, I don't know, India or South Africa or Colombia, ministries which are actually moving this forward in a systematic way and showing exactly how and measuring the difference in order to prove it, exactly how the formal system meets with the non-formal ecosystem in order to enable the child to develop the flourishing competencies that will help them thrive through life. So country proof of concept cases.
So those were our kind of 4 pillars, if you like, of a strategic framework to move forward. In my panel, certainly, I'm going to be inviting our expert witnesses to comment upon those, and how much use they are, if they add any value, or if there's something glaring that they think we have left out. But we're not naive. We're very aware that there are huge challenges to be faced. If you go to the next slide, thank you, Catherine. Clearly, we've already touched on the need to demonstrate relevance, and we haven't done it up to now. People still think it's a kind of nice to have, but very much on the sidelines, little piece of work that's going on somewhat irrelevantly to the main thrust of policy. We've got to show that we can improve effectiveness and bridge the gap between these sort of agile learning ecosystems and this somewhat formalistic and rigid. I don't want to caricature them, but too often national systems are really stuck in 20th century models. And also show how these can be made sustainable. These are formidable challenges and we know it. But as Michael's already indicated, Michael, you reckon there's some real challenge, sort of strategic opportunities to be grasped now, I think.
Next slide. Yes, next slide. So I think this would be an unbelievably difficult ask if we were still thinking about the way school systems have defined purpose since the middle of the 20th century and before, in terms of increasingly better foundational literacies, just the maths, the science, and the reading above all, in order to allow kids to go into jobs and sort of move up the escalator of the national economy. I don't think this will be possible in that world, but there is change. And I do think that the OECD's new framework, Education for Human Flourishing, makes the argument for that change and has shown what's wrong with the old ways, why we need flourishing, what it is, and the sort of competencies that will be needed and the system design that will be required. And I think it's about seizing that moment, which has the full support of many of the best traditional systems, you know, the Nordics, the Canadians, Singapore, Germany, Australia. It's about seizing that moment in order to insert the full potential of learning ecosystems. But also, secondly, recognizing that in our best ecosystems, these are not startups just getting out of the traps with a big idea. These are incredible organizations that have already stood the test of time. Many of them matured and have built, you know, dynamic practitioner fields. So how do we, and this is a South-South collaborative idea really, Valerie, how do we build on the expertise that's already there in ecosystems, continue to work on the really wicked problems, funding sustainability, capacity building, as you said, policy relevance, research and measurement. So continue to work at those problems, but really to take advantage of the practitioner depth now to drive the movement and scale it even further. So strategic opportunities, alignment with future education and dynamic practitioner field.
Thanks, Michael. Well, that's kind of where we've reached. The report can be read in full by scanning this QR code. Please take a look. We're going to be launching it in as many directions as we can and try to get more of a dialogue started about some of these proposals. And part of that is this session. So I'm going to kick off the first panel in which we're incredibly privileged to have some extraordinarily experienced and knowledgeable people who can comment on this range of issues, both the opportunities, the challenges, and our proposals for a framework taking us forward. My dear colleague Franco Mosso will be hosting the second panel. And we've got about 25 minutes for each of those to dig in and explore people's opinions, and also to make some connections with the global north, which has been the study or the subject of the studies which really initiated some of the conceptual work and indeed practical research work around learning ecosystems. And it's important, I think, not to lose sight of the kind of interconnections that could be made there. So for a start, I'm going to be welcoming to my panel Bobbi Macdonald from Education Reimagined. Hi, Bobbi, wave to the folks and see you here. Bobbi is a very extraordinary educator. If you look at the website of Education Reimagined, she is the author of a number of reports there, which focus on child-centered learning ecosystems and what that means, with relevance, I think, to Global South but right across the States. And one of the reasons I'm delighted, Bobbi, that you could join us is that in a sense you have been acting as a kind of an accelerator and a strategic organization arguing for this policy shift across the US, I think with considerable success. So I'm going to come back to you, Bobbi, in a minute, if I may. We're really privileged to have with us Boren Chakroun from UNESCO. Boren is the Senior Director there leading the Global Education Coalition. He was very generous with his time in being interviewed for this research. And Boren, I'd love to hear where you think we have taken it, and if we've added any value at all, or whether you could have written it on a wet afternoon without all the research that we spend time doing, but there you go. Thank you for joining us today. Also in the policy field, deeply experienced policymaker is Iwan Cyril from Indonesia. I think Iwan is probably the only one of us, Boren, maybe you were too, who's actually been in government. He was Director General for schools, primary through to secondary, in the whole of Indonesia. As you will all know, a huge system, an extraordinarily diverse, challenged system. And Iwan was Director General there at a time of great innovation, I think it's fair to say, and at a time with a new and extremely dynamic minister who talked the talk of ecosystems and was interested in making them a part of their policy platform. So welcome, Iwan. I'm going to come to you in a moment. Finally, absolutely by no means least, Juanita Naranjo Ramirez, who is from Fundación Mi Sangre in Colombia. Again, Juanita, I think it's fair enough to say that Fundación Mi Sangre does act as a kind of global advocate and indeed a contextual advocate, not just for a single ecosystem, for the very concept, the very mode of working, and has been an interlocutor with governments about how this can be achieved and where we go with that. So, where to start? Boren, may I begin with you, if I may, and invite you to comment on what you've heard so far, the 4 proposals in particular that the research group have made about this shift that we're seeking to achieve between ecosystems as a nice to have in the margins, philanthropically funded, towards the potential of being part of mainstream policy making. What's your view?
Well, thank you, Valerie. And I think that question is central when we think about one is the valorization of the ecosystem and their place in any broader learning systems. The second is about the stakeholders that are involved in the governance and the management of education system and what role they can have and how they can move from the periphery to the center, as we usually speak about the community of practice. The third is, of course, about the accountability on when it comes to the learning and the learning outcomes and the ecosystems performance. And the fourth is about what data, what evidence we have about them. So in a way, through the work you have done, you are putting on us new questions that we need to unpack and we need to consider. That's more, let me call it at the architecture system level. There is another layer which is more, let me call it the political economy of all this. Is these ecosystems or the perspective on ecosystem, can it advance our vision on a new social contract for education? And is it the right way to do? Is it something that we have evidence of its impact, or we are anticipating its impact in terms of advancing the new social contract for education, knowing that in the work that we have done on the future of education and speaking about the new social contract for education, we're speaking about the learning settings and the importance of connecting the learning, different learning spaces and learning settings. So in reality, it is discussed and presented, but it is not necessarily unpacked. And I think the work you are doing is helping us to unpack that. And through the ecosystem concept, it helps us to unpack what do we understand by learning settings? What do we understand by connecting learning settings? And how we place that in what I call it political economy. probably maybe the last point that would be important, which is again related to more rather global agenda, is how to place this discussion and this ecosystem perspective in the SDGs today, but particularly in the post-2030 agenda in the future. And what does it mean in terms of target, in terms of commitment, in terms of monitoring and evaluation, as I mentioned earlier. Last, and as some people will say, money talks. And the question is, of course, where the resources will come from, where they are available now. If we are expanding and giving the ecosystem a strategic place, where the resources will come from. Is it coming from people? Is it coming from communities, from education systems? And how we will convince the policymakers to direct part of the resources that are still low. Many member states, almost 2/3 of countries are not meeting the benchmarks of 4 to 6% of GDP, 15 to 20% of public expenditure. So who are in a way, the cost bearer in this case, and where the resources will come from in a moment where we are having rather shrinking of resources and shrinking. And because we are speaking about the global south, we are speaking also about a different, I would say, development aid architecture that is emerging. So these are some of the perspective that your work and the presentation is in a way bringing to the forefront, I think, in terms of discussion. Over to you.
Warren, thanks very much. And I want to take up that point, a number of points I'd love to come back to with you on. I'm not sure we'll have time, particularly that one around accountability. But the one I want to throw to Juanita now is the challenge you lay down about where are the resources coming from. And I'm sure, Juanita, you in your discussions with ministries, in your work in Latin America and beyond, face that question. Can you make a strong case for ecosystems being a much more cost-effective model than formal schooling systems working alone? And have you tried to do that?
Well, Valerie, thank you so much to everyone for being here and for that question. Well, the world is definitely changing. I think we're living today like a change of paradigms in terms of financing projects and the social work that we all do. Who is paying for that? And since last year, almost exactly 1 year ago, when they closed USAID, and then other governments started changing their policies and shutting down aid agencies, etc. I think social organizations have been and especially those working in education, and from Fundación Mi Sangre, we started to think about creative ways of funding our programs. And that has led us to create like different routes, and how can we create even like entrepreneurial ways of funding our programs. And Fundación Mi Sangre works around a systemic approach, and that systemic approach, it's always like forcing us move us around, working with different people that normally will not meet, and that require us not only to speak in with governments and with policymakers, but also with and like businesses and like big companies in Colombia, and make them involved in the addressing the social problems that we have. Colombia, we've been for over more than 50 years, we have an internal conflict, and these businesses normally do not engage or feel compelled to work within the roots and the root causes of the problems that we are facing. So now we are starting to not now, like many years ago, Fundación Mi Sangre has been working for over 20 years, but we've started to, we say that we are like sowing the soil, so that these programs and these policies can actually take roots. And if we do not nurture that soil, then the policies and everything that we think that we can do will not be possible. So we are creating trust, we are opening conversations in multi-sectoral ecosystems so that policymakers, entrepreneurs, business people, academia, social media, etc., understand the necessity of improving the educational system, working with children, going to the roots of the problems and of the challenges of society in general, and being able to work together. And that, of course, means taking money to the table and actually understanding that if enterprises do not address these problems, then they will have problems themselves for security reasons, for lack of capacities for their employees, productivity, etc. So we are always trying to weave this ecosystem and making everyone understand how these challenges affect them and how we can work together and bring together everyone's capacities to uplift and to create better conditions. So that's
Juanita,
a
thanks
little
for
bit.
that. But, I mean, the emphasis you've placed there is very much on changing the narrative. And
Exactly.
as Michael said in our earlier conversation, you can only do that if you are really specific about broadening the purposes of education and the outcomes that you're looking at and that you make count. And I'm really curious about how difficult that's been for you in the Colombian context. But I'd like to bring Iwan in here because he's done it. He had a minister who was using this language, both in country and beyond, as an argument for very significant shifts in direction. I'm curious to know, one, Iwan, how that was achieved, but secondly, to what extent it's been sustainable with change of ministerial personnel. And back to Borgen's point about political economies and how they define so much. But where's your thinking on this? Please let us know about the Indonesian experience.
Thank you, Valerie. I hope my internet is going okay, because I feel like there are some problems with mine. So, okay. So to answer Borgen's question, in short, yes, it is the way to go for us to think, and also like what we've done also going forward. And it's not only more efficient in terms of using resources, but it's also more effective. So efficient and effective. And let me tell you why. The first one is because one size fits all never works in a context that is so diverse. When we know we have adaptive challenges, we know it's not going to work. So that's why, it's not just not efficient, because then if you push that way, one size fits all paradigm, top down command and control, like usual business as usual, then you will get the same answer. And then of course, you will waste your resources. But the key to that is having a clear purpose. And to this, I want to bring the what Michael mentioned earlier about education for human flourishing. So we need to define the purpose that is encompassing the holistic view of child development, and also the countries or the society in general, where we envision our society, our planet will be. And that is our shared dream. And by then you can empower the stakeholders within the ecosystem to go towards that, to reach that purpose together. And you have to create a support system. I want to highlight two support systems. The first one is the human change agents. You need to recruit the change agents. You need to train your change agents. In our case, it was a new generation of school leadership training that is on the ground daily to fight on behalf of the purpose. And the second one is actually technology. Technology is the way that we use technology is not technology, the most sophisticated one, but the one that works within our context. So the technology that is still, can work within the weak signals, 2G, 3G connectivity. So then this can not only make the philosophy of trust and autonomy of these ecosystems to continuously learning, right? Learning is the key word there, not just ecosystem, but learning ecosystem. Technology empowers them to have some ideas, but also to connect and collaborate with each other. So we amplify the ecosystems through the use of technology. In our case, that's how we actually scale that. And we make the connection between not only, we have 552 decentralized local governments, right? So they collaborate with each other as well. So it's not just within their community, but they can have like some kind of like partners that they found through this platform, technology platform online. And this happens continuously. And I travel to all these small islands of our 17,000 islands, but I went to these remote islands and just like listen to them, like how did they experience the change, the innovation that they do. And it's through this connection. So we empower them. Of course, from the central government point of view, we give them the license to learn. By that we mean that you don't need to comply, but you get together and see like what kind of problem solving towards the purpose. Again, like the purpose is the key here, because these diverse contexts have different challenges and situations. It's just like, you know, like when you are sailing on the ocean, you need to have like a clear compass. Where do you want to go? And then they will innovate in a way that we cannot imagine. So pretend that our capital city, Jakarta, knows everything about how to answer the challenges in those remote areas or in diverse contexts. So our realization of that, I think, led to the way that empowering the community. But I think I mentioned this in our interview, your interview with me, Valerie. It's about tapping into our social gotong royong, which is the spirit of mutual collaboration, cooperation, solidarity. So tapping into our indigenous wisdom is another way also for us to kind of like coming home. This kind of philosophy for problem solving also connects with our social cultural roots.
That's so brilliant, and there's so much I'd love to dig into in that. So this is a very frustrating format in that all of you have so much more to say, and I know it, and I'm so sorry we can only take the headlines. But that's a great segue to Bobbi here, and so making the connection, which I think it's really important we don't lose with developments in the global north. Bobbi in Washington knows everything, doesn't it? So how far? Yeah, right. How far have you, as a kind of national, indeed international advocate for rethinking ossified education systems stuck in the 20th century paradigm towards the more fluid, the more grounded, more trusting, relational-based ecosystems? How successful do you think you've been in creating a new narrative within the US? And what can you share with us about what's been successful and what's failed?
I think there's a really amazing, powerful movement happening right now across the US. And it's kind of at the intersection of, because it's filling a need, and there's school districts all across the United States that are losing enrollment, they're losing families, they're losing money, they're losing. And so at the same time, the business folks are saying, we don't have the workforce that we need. And so there's a misalignment between the school system, what the workforce needs, what our community needs. And at the same time, you know, more than ever before, we have children saying they're unhappy or they don't feel hopeful. They don't have the support and connections they need. So all of those things are the conditions that are really allowing ecosystems to emerge. And our work at Education Reimagined is to find those bright spots and to work with, we run an ecosystem lab, and we find learner-centered sites, and we illuminate their work and then say, what are the systems that will support this? And we are finding this growing at such a quick rate right now. So we're feeling good about that. There's still a long way to go, Valerie. But partnering with these communities where ecosystems are emerging within real context, real policy, funding, and accountability context, and translating what's happening on the ground into insights for broader systems transformation, that's catching on in a way that's allowing more and more folks to do that across contexts. And you know, we're learning ecosystems make it possible because kids become known over time. They're not just measured at moments. They're supported by a network, not a single institution. They're seen for their assets, their culture, their strengths, their gifts. They're held in learning experiences that are relevant to their lives and communities. This is creating these strong, connected communities that know each other really well. And the amount that can get done, the outcomes that can be, you know, explored there and experienced by kids, families, and business is a powerful story. And so they're telling the stories, we're telling the stories, many partners in our field are telling those stories, but we're also working to say, let's do the research to build the evidence to show the outcomes, the impact, and how do ecosystems emerge. We have really strong systems already set up that are from a different era. How can they actually grow and change? You know, I've worked with districts, I've worked with small communities, big communities, whole states working together to redefine something, to expand that purpose of education and say, how do we operate in new ways? And then one of the challenges is then you have these heroic people trying to navigate and get around the existing policy. And that's not sustainable. And so really what we need is to enable that progress for those folks who are experiencing this and who are committed to this kind of working together, this kind of education that sees each child as unique and powerful and loving and capable and embedded in a community. You know, that part's really important. This isn't about becoming more individualistic. This is about becoming not only seeing the complexity of each human being, but our connections.
Yeah.
And ecosystems can hold that. So we created a playbook. We're doing work like this. My colleague, Sarah Bishop-Root and Transcend also created like a state level playbook to help states start to think about how do we create the conditions to move policy in a ways that will allow us to operate in new ways and to really make this a sustainable model. And I can share the link for that in the...
That would be great. And it's exactly that kind of activity that we envisage for in localities in the Global South, kind of strategic centers, accelerators taking on in order to make those connections. And Beren, at the risk of stealing time from my colleague Franco's panel, and I'm a bit sensitive to that, I will wrap up very quickly. But Beren, I would just love you to have a quick word about, perhaps it's naive, I don't know, but we do feel that making connections between Global North activities such as Bobbi has outlined there, and the kinds of great green shoots that Iwan's and Juanita has set out is a worthwhile enterprise. From a global organization like UNESCO, I presume you'd support that and not say, look, the conditions just are so different, so disparate, so diverse. There's very little dialogue to be had. What's your view?
Mm-hmm. No, first of all, I think obviously what we are discussing and the ecosystem approach and perspective can thrive if we are putting the human being and the learners at the center of it, but that we are also showing how this approach can do things differently and can be more effective in addressing some of the learning crises that we are facing. To give an example, I mean, if we have today 272 million young children who are out of school, our approach should be a way to fix this problem and say what this approach will bring in terms of initiatives, in terms of stakeholders, in terms of better learning outcomes, eventually in terms of socioeconomic outcomes for these people and their families. So I think it cannot remain in a conceptual manner. We need to bring it to earth and say, look, if we want to fix the out-of-school children, this is something that we can take. If we want to fix the 670 million illiterate person, this is something that we can mobilize and we can do. And what we are bringing from the conceptual framework is to say that more education and more learning is not more schooling. Learning happens in different places, and I think Michael was mentioned that it happens in communities, in families, in museum, in the workplace, in natural spaces. So I think that's very important to do. What probably, and I would like to finish with that, I know the time, is we have some good experiences. First, we have a good experience when it comes to vocational training and partly the higher education when it is related to validation of prior learning. For example, we have quite good experiences in many countries on how you recognize learning from the workplace mainly. We have some countries that have established tools for portfolio building for young people and trying to connect the different learning spaces and learning opportunities. The technology is supporting us creating this portfolio, but we need to be aware about the digital divide and all the issues related to that. So, I was looking at the chat and many experiences, many initiatives that are happening. So maybe the challenge for us, and this is an action, if I would like to set an action for us, is that first of all, how are we able to map those initiatives and make them more visible, more, I would say, accessible? Because that's something that we need to do, and the impact that we see, and then how this can be then brought into policy making in terms of the new policy strategies, sector plans, the funding of the sector plans. So these are things that will connect the dots in a more, I would say, operational manner. Over to you.
Thank you. And that was the question that we posed, and we are edging towards what we think are some decent answers. Thank you, my dear panel, and apologies that we couldn't give you more time to develop and explore your the depth of your understandings of this. I'm frustrated but deeply grateful. Franco, apologies to you for nicking some of your time, but let me hand over control to you and look forward to you introducing your panel.
Thank you, Valerie. No, I think this is a fascinating conversation. Thank you to all of you. And let's dive right in. We have our next panel has three wonderful colleagues. There's Alex
Franco,
Beard.
maybe I should have introduced you. Franco, I should say, was eminently well suited to lead this part of the work because he himself was the leader of Enseña Peru, an extraordinary ecosystem working in Peru, which we learned a huge amount from, but is now transferred to Toronto and joined our research team, for which we were eternally grateful. So sorry to interrupt you.
Thank you, thank you, Valerie. No, but it was so I bring a little of two worlds in this context. So yeah, let's dive right into the second conversation, which will be, I think, about implementation. Exactly, I think a little bit into what Borgen was saying. When you're in the field, when we are observing initiatives, what are the key challenges for practitioners out there, as well as policymakers and researchers? So let me bring our three guests. Alex Beard should be here around. He's Senior Director at the Global Learning Lab, Teach for All, longtime colleague, and he supports this incredible global network of leaders working in systemic change, trying to understand it better and how to implement it across contexts. Our second panelist is Camila Pereira, here as well. She, a wonderful colleague, now serving as a CEO at Global School Leaders. It's an organization that saw the potential of school leadership, but also saw that school leaders do not receive enough training, support, policy frameworks, research, etc. And so addressing that gap, engaging ecosystems around this challenge of helping school leaders serve their countries in the best way possible. And Omar Carga, he should be here as well. Omar, great to see you. He's a fellow at Brookings, specifically in this wonderful initiative called Sparks, a project in the Center of Universal Education, where he, with practitioners across the world, explores how mindsets, values, experiences, systems, and structures, and other intangible factors have influenced pedagogy. And I think there is something interesting about the invisible pedagogies, right? That we have heard over time, which I found fascinating. So let's dive right in. We've heard, I just want to ground us back to think about what we are talking about here, which is a different approach, two key characteristics. We're talking about integrating formal, non-formal, and informal educations, right? And then somehow that becoming a preferred policy approach, and that is not quite the reality in most countries today. We're talking about a much more collective approach that centers relationship building, trust, shared purpose, like the collectiveness as opposed to silos, and making somehow that work. And we're saying that this approach, learning ecosystems, could be a way to do it. Like if you're in the field, you're thinking about, maybe I will do this very specific intervention, very controlled, in and out, linear, or maybe I'll go taking a more learning ecosystems approach. That there's a difference in it. And so I wanna ask you about what you have observed from each of your perspectives. There's a phrase in Peru that we say, comprarse el pleito, meaning you take something and you take it with your advantages, but also with the challenges. No, you take the whole package of an approach. What's the whole package? What differentiates this approach, in your opinion, both in its advantages in implementation? What does this approach? What is the magic? How is it different? What opportunities does it open that with other approaches you cannot open? And then also, what would you say are key challenges that also come with the adoption of this approach? Let's start with Camila, maybe.
Thanks, Franco, and thanks everyone for the invitation to participate in this very, very interesting debate. Well, I think, as you know, Franco, Alex knows this by now as well. I'm a big fan and very enthusiastic about this ecosystem approach, this learning ecosystem. And I say this because in my experience, first leading large-scale education initiatives here in Brazil, I'm speaking to you from São Paulo, Brazil, and now at Global School Leaders, where we are working across the Global South. Most successful education projects I've been involved in has included elements that I associate with this ecosystem approach. So first, of course, the magic for me is what you were referring to in terms of not being siloed, but really creating spaces where school leaders, policymakers, practitioners, researchers, funders can learn from one another rather than working isolated, right? I've done that in the mobilization for the learning standards in Brazil, a major advocacy effort we've had. And now we are doing that at GSL with the regional hubs on school leadership that you participated on the inception. So I think that involving multiple and diverse stakeholders to co-create shared solutions is magical in this approach. They are more effective because you have diverse perspectives at the table. And it's especially important in adversity contexts where policymakers are usually not so connected to the reality of students and public schools to create the solutions that we need. So that is one aspect. And the other one that dialogues with this is there is a strong component, I understand, of continuous learning and improvement in effective learning ecosystems, right? These feedback loops where you really make sure that practitioners are informing policy and policy is informing practice. And we don't see that a lot in more traditional education systems. Policy is often designed far from classrooms. And I think that's a key aspect. And of course, I need to highlight here school leaders. I think Ewan mentioned it, the change agents, and you highlighted that in the chat as well. For me, it's clear that every reform, curriculum, equity initiative that we can think about in the education system has to pass through a school leader to become real in practice, in classrooms. So a learning ecosystem approach for me, when this approach empowers the individuals in the system, it is really powerful to make more effective policies get to the classroom level. I would say one big challenge for me is capacity, right? It is not easy to implement an effective learning ecosystem approach. You have to be very intentional about how you facilitate spaces, who you bring to the table, it's not an easy thing to do. So having that capacity at scale in a system to approach education from that perspective is not easy at all. And it's a huge bottleneck in my perception for this implementation at scale.
Super interesting. Let's go around the table, but I really like these points of what this approach favors, no? And it seemed that what you said is that it favors connections, better connections across levels. It favors collective learning needed for the future, but it also brings a challenge of this is specifically, I think I heard you say about the part of facilitation. Sometimes it is a different set of skills, right? To be able to not only run a program or a specific curriculum, etc., but contribute to building relationships. Those are different skills. And so why don't we connect with Alex? Alex, we've been talking a lot about collective leadership and what does it imply for system change. What's your take on this?
Yeah, thanks, Franco. So, as Franco said, we've brought together lots of organizations for the past couple of years on this topic within our network and beyond. And I recall that our friend Tomas in Chile, he starts telling this story by talking about earthquakes in Chile. And he says, when earthquakes happen, obviously amidst the adversity that causes, something quite amazing happens amongst people. People from all parts of communities and societies who know or don't know each other come together to sort out the issue, to recover the sites that have been ruined, to support people through the trauma. And this happens quite naturally in support of whatever the state and its plans that it has to respond to crises. And he says, we do this in earthquakes, but we don't do it for these problems of deeper adversity that exist within our societies. Instead, we outsource dealing with that adversity to the formal school system, to our institutions, to the government. But then for me, it brings to mind this line by the anthropologist David Graeber, and he writes that all of the institutions that we rely on today, from insurance to pensions to hospitals to schools, weren't originally created by governments, but originally created by citizens coming together to create things to mitigate the issues and reach the opportunities that they have in front of them. And I think the magic of the learning ecosystem approach is that it restores that sense of collective responsibility back to us as communities and citizens working in partnership with the formal institutions of the state. It says, what's happening outside the formal school system is at least as important as what is happening inside it. It says that we all have a say in what our children should be learning, how they should be learning, but not just that. With the say comes a responsibility for actually having agency in supporting that learning as well. And so I think that's a radical idea and a radical proposal in a world where we as citizens have become very used to outsourcing all of this stuff to government and to institutions. And so when we talk about learning ecosystems, I love this point that Borja made about a new social contract for education. It's absolutely true that the contract that we make with our children, get your head down in school and you'll be okay for life, is broken. Like that is just no longer working out. But with the new contract, I don't think we simply ask, okay, what's the government going to do for our kids? But also what we can do for each other and for them and for our communities or countries. So I think that new contract has to ask something on both sides rather than just on the side of schools. I think the last thing, the challenge is, I think we've lost the muscle and the habit of doing this kind of stuff, of taking responsibility for what's going on around us. And we talk about bringing people together to build shared purpose, build collective agency, build trust, to learn, just as you were saying, Camilla, completely agree with all that you shared. it's a bit hard. Second challenge, like where do you begin this stuff? Like where do you intervene? Like we've always thought, okay, to improve education, work with government. Simple story. But if it's a learning ecosystem, where do you get started? Like who do you work with? Like, I was even talking to Jaime Saavedra at the World Bank, and he's like, sometimes it's government, sometimes civil society, sometimes donors. Like you got to sort of figure this stuff out. And then thirdly, how do you know it's working? Like it's not as simple as like, test scores in schools. Like how do you know this thing that we all believe in, which takes a very long time, is actually happening? So I think those are some of the challenges that I think come up as well.
Super interesting. So you speak to a cultural component, no? That many people feel that we've lost of thinking that precisely because the other approach centers everything that is formal, mostly. No, lots of people take their hands off the wheel sometimes, and we've grown accustomed to that over centuries. Maybe it's a provocative thought, and I think that something else that I picked up was I've been in that kind of work and saw how what starts as agency ends up as just a very few amount of people in a community really being engaged with it with the effort, no? Or sometimes what starts as agency and commitment ends as cooptation because like the crippling of the spirit of doing learning ecosystems that has its own rhythms. Where do you stand, Omar, in this map when you think about the advantages and the challenges of this approach?
Thank you, Franco. And it's to echo Kamla, it's a privilege to be part of this really unique conversation that we don't really have in the global education space as often as we should. I think with all of the challenges that we're looking at, with the call for education systems transformation, ecosystem approach is probably one of our best solutions to meeting these challenges, the poly crisis that we're facing in the globe, and the need to reimagine what education is. And we have to remember that schooling as an institution is a relatively new institution. It's about 250 years old. If you put that in the context of education as a human endeavor, that just pales in the comparison. So we have to really delve into our histories, our futures, and our current problems. So I'm going to, knowing that time is short, I'm going to maybe situate some comments around what Michael mentioned in one of the 4 points, the country proof of concept. In 2019, I believe, I worked with the UN in Afghanistan with President Ashraf Ghani and Minister Rangina Amidi of Ministry of Education to actually put ecosystems on a national agenda. And this became the driving force of the Afghanistan national education policy that became law in 2000. Unfortunately, as you know, in 2001, the Afghan government fell. However, to just kind of go back to the magic of how it came into becoming a national agenda, it was to tie to Boren's point, and in terms of tying it to problems that policymakers are facing. In Afghanistan, there was two major problems. One of them that's very common across the world. Schooling system was not, it wasn't meeting SDG 4 goals. And the country was trying to figure out how do we meet SDG 4 goals, quality, inclusive, equitable education with the schooling system. And we said, maybe we need to expand and evolve. The second problem that the government was facing was that there was two educational systems. One was the madrasa system, that had existed for centuries, and then there was the modern schooling system. These were in conflict. And if you map the history of Afghanistan and a lot of countries across the world in which schooling came into the countries as a colonial project, as a mechanism of modernization, or all of these other things, it brought with it conflict. So how do we deal with these two things at the same time? And for both of these, what we worked on was that you can't meet the SDG 4 goals simply by just relying on schools, because you get curriculum overload, you don't have enough teachers, you don't have enough infrastructures, and all of these things. And then when there is one system of education that could be viewed as foreign, as from the outside, or at the minimum as being privileged over other ways of knowing, education becomes a source of conflict. So we propose that we go beyond schooling, not get rid of schooling, but go beyond schooling and create an education ecosystem. So I think that's what the magic is for me in terms of the ecosystem model, in terms of it can open up space to multiple learning avenues. It can diversify not only the avenues, but also learning styles that people have. The work that we do with the invisible pedagogical mindsets is that there's no best practice pedagogy. You have to work within each context to put things together that make sense for that environment and for that group of students that we're trying to reach. To kind of go into the next part of your question in terms of what is needed, Alex kind of pointed to a lot of these things out. I put a thing in the chat. One of the really important things that we need to do is get out of this indicator that's out of school children, because that is a very tunneled vision of learning. I wrote a paper, I think it was last year or a couple of months ago, arguing for making a global shift to out of education children as the indicator that we measure. But then there are challenges, and how do you do that? One of them is, how do you capture education that's happening outside of schooling? Schooling is really good at bringing everybody together. It's easy to capture the learning that's taken place. So we need to figure out how to capture learning that's happening outside of schooling. Maybe AI can help us with all of these challenges to some extent. It's by no means a silver bullet. We need to accredit educational outlets that are outside of schooling, because we can't just say that people are learning and not have an accreditation system, because we know that there's different levels of learning that take place. And then based on that, we need to credential those learning experiences so that they can build into a portfolio that can either go towards higher education or go towards the job market. So those were some just general thoughts that I hope I touched your main areas of the questions that you posed.
That's amazing. I've been synthesizing. Thank you, Omar. I think this blew my mind. These ideas of allowing different ways of knowing. This approach might make room for that, for having that happen. Other ways of knowing, other ways of learning. I was touched by the point that you said about this. I'm usually critical of the language that we use for certain metrics. No, like out of school children. It sometimes it means in society they're not learning anything, but that's not true. No, and so this is a response to that. For our audience, as we come to a close of this panel, I was synthesizing. You know, my wife says that I have a span of attention of about 12 seconds, and so just in case, I was working hard in capturing what is, and I reflect a lot about this, like what is unique about this approach when you implement, no, like the in the detail, and there are a number of things here that I captured in terms of what this favors, like the kinds of opportunities when you are in the field, when you are executing, trying to sort out executing this model, not this model, this approach, this way of thinking through education, and then where does it challenge us? We've had an exceptional conversation. Thank you to the three of you. I've learned a lot today. And hopefully we can keep the discussion going, because I do think that connecting both panels, this area of making the challenges, making it more concrete. I've had this discussion with policymakers as well, and it's like, but how do I do this? Like, I have to write a piece of policy. Everything that you're telling me, how does it go? How does it run in a piece of policy? There's the many areas that we have to do now. So I was really grateful and humbled for this debate. Thank you to the three of you. And back to the team.
So I think we are to you now, Olivier.
You're muted, Olivier.
Yep. So first, I'm seeing Franco in big. Oh, now I'm seeing myself in big. First and foremost, I would really like to thank all the people that have been contributing, all the learning ecosystems that have been contributing to the session today, but to the work we've been doing over the past year, all the researchers. When I started working in education, this was 18 years ago, and was first inspired by Charlie Ledbetter's paper on learning from the extremes, which was funded by Cisco and Michael at Cisco, I think, Michael Stevenson. And we followed up with Valerie with a book you wrote on learning a living, also very inspired by learning in the most adverse circumstances. But 18 years later, the last 5 years, working with learning ecosystems across the Global South, for me, it's the most stimulating learning experience. That's where so many of the meaningful approaches, really grounded in the communities, finding alternative ways of doing things, are just absolutely fantastic. And I'm not going to summarize everything. I'm just going to take a few steps. So do look at the report. We hope it captures some of the incredible wealth of innovations, inspiring practices that learning ecosystems are doing on the ground, but there's much more to deep dive into, and we'll continue doing things around this. To go back to some of the key points, I think we were at UNGA in September, and across so many events, conversation came that we need to shift the purpose of education. So Iwan was mentioning the purpose as being essential. We heard Michael talking about the Education for Human Flourishing frameworks from OECD. Boren about the new social contract. This idea of shifting the purpose is absolutely essential, but there are other topics which were discussed during UNGA as essential for transformation. The second one was learning ecosystem as being really essential. So a shift of purpose, learning ecosystem. Another very core dimension was about meaningful youth engagement. And this morning at UNESCO headquarters, the whole event for International Day of Education was about meaningful youth engagement. And the other point which was raised is about real radical collaboration across players. So I think I'm taking the opportunity of this moment there. We all had discussion together. Omar, we've been discussing a lot about how can the work we've been doing join forces with the work that you are doing with Brookings Institution. Alex and all the Teach for All network, we've had this conversation quite often. I know that Camilla, you've been having similar conversation with Franco. I know that Ross is here and is doing incredible work on learning ecosystems, and all the other players here. So whether it's meaningful youth engagement, whether it's the shift of purpose in education, whether it's really putting learning ecosystem at the forefront of policies and things like this, none of this is going to be easy. The young people this morning, the students and youth-led organization were sharing their enthusiasm, their hopes, but their frustrations also. They are being consulted. There's a new report which is coming out, but how is the implementation going to happen? So in the work we've been doing over the past year, we've discussed a lot of the barriers, the difficulties that have to be addressed. So I'm just closing for myself, and then we have, I think, 15 minutes for question and answers with the room, which would be great, but about a real call for continuing our collaboration and really around supporting the learning ecosystems, because I see this as a core priority. We have just become a UNESCO Category 2 center for youth engagement and learning ecosystems notably. So, but very, with a lot of humility, participating in this with you two together. We really want to take it forward. And I know that quite a few of you also. So that was just a invitations. Let's continue this conversation. Omar, you said there are two scarce. Let's have them much more. There's one already on Monday. Deep diving into the South-South Collaborative. I will ask Cathy to share the link for Monday. There are more conversations on learning ecosystems taking place in the coming days during the festival, the 750 events. I shut up now. It's a huge thank you to the contributors today, but it's a huge thank you to the incredible work done by all the learning ecosystems we've been able to work with and many others would like to work with. And maybe, Valerie, if you want to take the lead, because you've been the host, for Q&As for the next 12 minutes for people. I know there's an incredible wealth of expertise within the room. And so it would be great if we can have questions and contributions. Ross, that's fantastic. So I'm giving you the floor and then Valerie can take over.
Yeah, no, thanks, Olivier. Thanks for that. It's quite wrong that Ross, who has been so critical to this movement globally through his work in a number of contexts, hasn't had a chance to say anything. So, Ross, may I bring you in and invite you to say whatever
thanks so much. No, I don't think of it as wrong at all. I'm just really delighted that so many brilliant people are moving forwards with this, what I consider a critical way of doing things. My point or question is really around the resourcing end of this, and I don't know if it's a question or an observation. So it seems to me that on the one hand, we do agonize a bit over how do we fund this kind of complex work, and what I'm hearing is two things. One of which is we need to get much better at being resourceful, which I think gets into the efficiency and it touches on efficiency. The other side is that we need to start looking at hybrid financing, and perhaps because we're taking an ecosystemic approach, we can reach beyond classical education, public education budgets to touch on health budgets, environment budgets, etc., etc. And I think in that hybrid financing piece, we need to get serious about the work. What does that actually mean? Because on the one hand, I think we need to create funding mechanisms that allow for hybrid pooled funds, which then fund portfolios of projects. In other words, mitigate the risks of any single project. So there's some complex financing work I think needs to happen. But otherwise, I'd just like to congratulate everyone on the report and all the work, which is a brilliant contribution.
Ross, that's a fantastic point. Thank you very much. I think it was Boren and indeed Iral who raised the issue of cost effectiveness. And I think, we shouldn't be sort of converging in our thinking between it's either philanthropic or it's government, or maybe a bit of a joint piece, but really, as you've said, a hybrid drawing on many other kinds of budgets. And certainly Boren in his interview made the point, and I think Juanita did too, that the withdrawal of USAID and the changed geopolitical situation that we find ourselves in is forcing a rethink as to how this work is collectively resourced. And I think that's a really fascinating point. It's going to be a bit hard for me to see any hands going up, but if anyone would like to come back on the hybrid resourcing, Alex, I don't know if you've got perspective on that one.
I did put something in the chat. Just that I think we've been fortunate to find a few voices amongst the donor community who I think are beginning to think in this way. I mean, there's a long way to go, but there's a Shibalal Family Foundation in India, which is backing the Shikshagraha movement, which is like a single powerful donor, like building a huge network of organizations and activities. John Rendell, who was previously at Peter Kundal, is doing some work for XTX. basically thinking, what does education sector funding need to look like? And he's making arguments for 25-year investments in people within the ecosystem rather than in particular programming. And I thought there's some interesting work at the Blavatnik School of Government with the Government Outcomes Lab there, looking at sort of social outcomes funding, mainly in a UK setting. But things like All Child have got an interesting funding mechanism where it's government money, but there's lots of flexibility about how it's spent within a community. And then if I can riff on that, like a second point, I think is, like, I think we need in this learning, the term learning ecosystems, we all love it and it works for me, but I think we need to find ways to make this sort of visible, legible, attractive, attention grabbing to a wide variety of audiences. And I think we might need different stories for different groups. Like, what is the story that we tell about this to a donor group? What is the story we tell at government? And actually, what's the demand as well? What do we want those different groups to do? And I think that we're sufficiently committed to this idea that we could start doing that work really well, like go beyond the big picture to like, okay, the tactics. Like, I feel that's where we're ripe to get into.
Yeah. Interestingly, Alex, in the doing of the work, we know we haven't got the stories right yet. We all know it's central and key, and we've got to get better at it. But we even thought that the very vocabularies, the nomenclature that we're using, doesn't cut it, doesn't really play. And we asked a lot of people who were part of this, so what's a better term, to ecosystem? And the problem is that there isn't one that really captures the totality. People will say, well, community-based. Well, yes and no, because it's not all about being, well, obviously the problems. We couldn't find, maybe others on this call do have, some really good ideas about, one, the kinds of stories that really cut through, and two, the kind of language, the nomenclature, the vocabulary that is much more transparent, sounds less academic, less conceptual, and can connect. So that was one of our failed challenges, I think. We know we haven't got that right yet. If anyone else would like to comment on that one, it's very hard. But please wave your arms about if you'd like to comment. Don't put a virtual hand up. Bobbi, what about you in terms of how you managed to talk about this in a context now where people are very anxious about not being woke? Are you worried about being woke when you use this kind of language in the States?
I'm not worried about being woke. But
being attacked for it, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely, being tactful and strategic with it. And what we found is we really want to meet folks where they are, and so we are finding that learning ecosystems is catching on, and people are starting to get it because it's such a great metaphor for this, such like, what is a thriving ecosystem in nature? What would it look like thriving in your community? But we are really starting with folks where they are. So what is the educational narrative of this community, of this place? And when they come together to create a shared vision of what they could see as possibility for their kids, what are the words that they use, and how do they name it? But we're not finding that ecosystem, that term is holding us back. It's more about the process itself of folks coming together, creating that shared vision and saying, if we operate in this new way of these deepened connections, what can we make possible for kids that is not possible right now?
Yeah.
And
I think the point you make there about starting where people are is absolutely central, and that came through loud and clear. And I remember when Franco was not part of the research team, but was still leading Enseña Peru, and we were trying to say, well, what do we mean by thriving? What do we mean by flourishing in this world? And Franco said, it's not for you lot to say. It's for the communities to determine what their understanding of that is in their context and their understanding. And that'll differ. And, live with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where they are. So what are the problems and the issues and the challenges and the aspirations that they have, not you?
Exactly. And just to add one more thing, when you honor the uniqueness of each community and you say context really matters, these people, these time, these place, then it becomes the struggle of, well, then what can we replicate? This isn't we can't scale any one model, but how does it spread? Yeah. And so that's when that really powerful storytelling is really helpful. And just how many ways can we make the ecosystem visible? Like, let's dance it, let's sing it, let's do visual expressions, let's do storytelling. Like, that's one of the ways that we joyfully approach the work.
But I think going back to the North-South connections, that's exactly the point that Iwan was making earlier about the re-establishment, the honouring of local communities and indigenous forms of culture and knowledge, actually, which of course we have lost at our peril. Colleagues, I think we are pretty much at the end of our... Olivier, let me hand back to you.
I'm just jumping in to some of the points you were raising. Something we discussed a lot with Franco also in his experience as head of Enseña Peru and then as a researcher. I think, Franco, we discussed a lot that the ability from these very different learning ecosystems, which are rooted locally, to share and learn from each other. There was a doubt, is there something that is really going to work? But I think, Franco, you told me that you were learning so much more from this diversity than you would have dreamt of, really. And Valerie, I know you were always challenging, can we really do a South-South collaborative? Can it work? Can we learn from this? And I think it's been an incredible learning pathway to be able to have exchanges between Colombia and Bangladesh and Indonesia and India and South Africa. And the AI tools and the practices that we made it much less expensive. And we needed the workshops, we needed this time for sharing, but for documenting, for making accessible in different languages, all the research, all the interviews, everything. I think that Iwan mentioned the technology that can be quite light, but that can help us build a very meaningful South-South collaborative and North-South also. And I think it's an important point to really come back to the extreme wealth of sharing and learning from each other and spreading the story by doing so.
Indeed, Olivier, and if anything I've said in the past has seemed to denigrate that, I don't feel that at all. Perhaps it was a different point. But I think that leaves us with the question, where to from here? We're not going to solve that in the next 1 minute, but we put it on the table. We want to continue this work. Obviously, we care about it. And we'd love to work in partnership with colleagues on this call. So any ideas you have about where we go next, how we take it to the next level, we'd love to hear from you. And Learning Planet Institute is our mothership in this connection. So we look to you, Olivier, to convene us, to be the recipient of ideas. I'm certainly up for the next level of activity. So thanks, everyone, and goodbye from me.